Thank you so much. We will, if folks have questions about this, we know that this is a very rich history that we're just really giving everyone a snapshot to hear about. It's important that we didn't want to assume anyone knew or didn't know about U.S. Puerto Rico relationships. And so thank you all for being so concise, we can always say more during the question and answer. So the second question that we have is we're going to talk more about PROMESA, and so describe the development, the implementation of PROMESA, and the impacts it will have on Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans abroad. In your opinion, and based off of your knowledge and expertise, what do you believe the people of Puerto Rico want regarding how to address the economic conditions that currently exist? So you each will have a little bit more time this time, 5 minutes. And we'll start with Nelson, then it'll be followed by Federico, Dr. Velasquez, and then Ani.
For me, it's helpful conceptually to take a longer economic perspective on how PROMESA came into existence, meaning not just look over the last few years, not even look at the elimination of 936 in the year 2006, but go to the inception of the economics of Puerto Rico. So to give you a quick context, the United States goes in 1898. The next year, Huracán San Ciriaco was the most devastating hurricane of the 19th century. It hit Puerto Rico. The United States had no meaningful relief. Puerto Rico lost roughly $50 million of its coffee crop, the entire coffee crop. Many thousands of people went homeless. Many thousands of farms were destroyed. But the United States sent no hurricane relief in '99. Instead, in the following year, 1900, what it did is it depreciated the Puerto Rican currency by 40%. Everyone had to engage in a currency exchange. So every Puerto Rican peso was now worth 60 American cents. And these are two currencies of roughly equivalent buying power. Are you there?
Yeah, we're listening. Great information.
Are you there? Okay, because I thought it was that. And so what it was a straight-out dispossession of Puerto Ricans of 40% of their wealth. If that were to happen in the United States, just think if you woke up tomorrow and you had everything you had, your house, your bank account, everything was 40% less, and all your debts and your student loans and your mortgage were 40% higher. This country would cease to exist as in its current format. There would be riots. It would be complete chaos. This is what was done to Puerto Rico in 1900. The year after the hurricane. And in the following year, in 1901, through the Hollander Act, they created a steeply graduated set of property taxes that never existed in Puerto Rico under the Spanish. So you have this Naomi Klein shock doctrine. You have a hurricane, currency devaluation, taxes. The farmers are now desperate for liquidity. They need anything they can to hold on to their farms. Well, there was one appropriately called an institution called the American Colonial Bank. That was the name of it. And that bank was like Phil Rizzuto at the money store. Come on down. We got money, no problem. Money, easy credit. Well, the farmers had to. They were desperate. But there was no usury law restriction in Puerto Rico. And that's what the American Colonial Bank wanted. They didn't want the loans to be repaid. That's why they were very free with the debt. They wanted the collateral. They wanted the land. And within 30 years, over half of the Puerto Rican agriculture, of the land, of the arable land in Puerto Rico, was owned by North American banking syndicates. Guanica, Aguirre, East Puerto Rico Sugar, and Fajardo. Each of those alone owned about 10% of the overall land under cultivation for sugar. They turned a previously self-sustaining diversified agriculture into a one-crop cash cow economy, that of sugar. And they did it by taking the land away from the poor, and they did it legally, by injecting debt where it should never have existed. They created the conditions, the crisis, where people would lose their land. So now I bring all that as a way for a context where we are now. Because of the Jones Act, and that's a principal element in this, Puerto Rico's an island. It has to import and export so many things. I don't know if you know this, but Puerto Rico is the fourth largest market for U.S. goods in the world. There's more Walgreens and Walmarts per square mile in Puerto Rico than anywhere else on the planet. Right now, it is an enormous. The value of Puerto Rico, the United States, is as a market. And so, under those conditions, without being able to develop its own shipping, it has to accept whatever pricing structure American corporations give. So when all these goods cost more from the foreign registry vessels, the Jones Act makes sure that all the American goods are overpriced. So coming forward now, since Puerto Ricans are not able to develop their own private economy, their own private sector or entrepreneurial class, the public sector grows exponentially, meaning government. And then the government is dependent on foreign capital to come in. And all that foreign capital, especially American corporations, they get these 20-year tax exemption deals where they don't repatriate any of the profits back into Puerto Rico. And when the exemption ends, when the 20 years go, like the IRS 936, which expired in 2006, and all the pharmaceuticals left the country, and Puerto Ricans lost nearly 100,000 jobs within 1 year, that's because it's structured that way, so that it's always these foreign companies, U.S. corporations, that are benefiting from the tax structure in Puerto Rico. So how does this now lead to PROMESA? In the year 2006, the pharmaceutical companies left. Enormous unemployment. But then Wall Street traders immediately went to Puerto Rico, and they sold them all these financial instruments, which are debt. It's the same sort of debt scenario that was created back in the early 1900s. And this debt was, much of it was illegal because it violated the Puerto Rican Constitution, which limits you to only 16% of the previous year's gross domestic product. So it was illegal from the point of view of COFINA, but it was also illegal, especially at PREPA, the Power Authority, because there's a 23-page study, and I've written about it in my blog, that found very detailedly that it was a Ponzi scheme, that the Electrical Authority was being sold bonds. 82% of the funds for each of those Series A bonds was to pay the interest on the preceding bonds. So it was a Ponzi scheme where one bond was paying off the interest of the preceding bonds. And PREPA racked up $4 billion in debt over a period of 4 years, from 2009 to 2013, with those bonds. Then they turn around and they send a financial control board to make sure that they're paid on those bonds. So what we have is a scenario where in the United States, people don't hear about this. They don't have a robust discussion of the Jones Act. They don't see how people got infected with debt that was essentially illegal, and now they have a credit collection agency called PROMESA to make sure that this debt is repaid. That's what happens when you're a colony.
Wow. Thank you. Federico? We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I put it in mute so that my coughing would interrupt Dennis. So I'm glad that Dennis went back to the historical context. To add to that, I would add that part of the policies implemented in the early 1900s and early 1920s was to convert Puerto Rico from a robust agricultural economy with coffee, like Nelson mentioned, tobacco and other products, solely basically a monoculture for sugarcane and sugar. So basically the Americans converted Puerto Rico into a mini sugar factory and put everything else on the side. And that impoverished local business. And the problem with sugarcane is that there's tiempo muerto, which is dead time literally, which means that the sugarcane isn't a crop that is all year round. So that also creates cycles of poverty because you can't have that crop all year round, and then what are you supposed to do for the rest of the year? And that's largely in part why the large Puerto Rican migration started in the 1930s and the 1950s. Also, as Dennis would say, the government of Puerto Rico promoted the migration of Puerto Ricans back to the States to work in factories. So just to go back to that, Puerto Rico's economy did transform, and some of it was good and some of it was bad. The Americans started to realize that their model wasn't working. We had Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which didn't work in Puerto Rico, but he did put in place people who actually wanted to help. Some would say that the last American governor in Puerto Rico, Rexford G. Tugwell, was one of the best governors, whether they were elected or not, in Puerto Rican history. And Puerto Rico started to industrialize. And what that did was it did destroy the agricultural sector of Puerto Rico, but it raised the standard of living tremendously. Puerto Rico was known as the poorhouse of the Caribbean. Just to give you context, in the 1940s, Puerto Rico's income per capita was $121 per person per year, poorer than Haiti. And then after industrialization, in the 1960s, it was $3,000 per person per year, and Puerto Rico became a modern industrialized country. Now, several things happened with that. I think there's an echo. Somebody may have their, okay, never mind. So after Puerto Rico industrialized, literacy rate went up dramatically, but with Commonwealth, the political and economic structures were still not there for full economic development. Puerto Rico suffered in the 1970s under the oil embargo. That's when Section 936 that Nelson alluded to was created, which basically allowed U.S. manufacturing companies to set up in Puerto Rico and be able to repatriate their profits to the U.S. mainland free of federal tax. That created a boom in Puerto Rico. 300,000 jobs depended on that. But because of the Jobs Act, because of so much dependency on that section and not developing a native industrial base, when the Republicans and Bill Clinton decided in the 1990s to phase out that section, Puerto Rico lost 100,000 jobs. And that created an economic crisis, which started in 2006 after the recession that still hasn't ended today. Some would call it a depression. And so what happens? So the government loses revenue, banks lose the deposits of those 936 companies, and there's a lot less money circulating in the economy. And the government in Puerto Rico started to borrow recklessly. Wall Street obviously lent at usurious rates, and Puerto Rico just mismanaged, unfortunately, the financial situation. But it's a shared responsibility. Congress played a role in eliminating 936. Congress played a role in denying Puerto Rico parity in healthcare funding, like our other panelists said. And it's Congress who's held Puerto Rico's economy hostage, not being able to, reach agreements for its trade policy internationally and have more flexible policy that applies to Puerto Ricans. The level of poverty in Puerto Rico is almost half of the population. So when you apply the U.S. welfare and economic system, which is the system of the most powerful industrialized country in the world, to basically a developing economy, which is the case of Puerto Rico, things just don't add up. So that led to PROMESA. Puerto Rico's debt, $72 billion, is unsustainable. And so that led the government to ask for Chapter 9 re-inclusion. What that means is that Chapter 9 allows states and to allow their municipalities and publicly owned corporations to declare bankruptcy. In 1984, out of the blue, Congress decided to take that away from Puerto Rico, and we're suffering the consequences now. Since we don't have the ability to go bankrupt, the U.S. Treasury Department, along with the current governor and the resident commissioner, which is the non-voting delegate in Puerto Rican Congress, came up with the idea, well, let's allow Puerto Rico to restructure its debt, the whole debt, even though the Constitution of Puerto Rico says that the first expenditure that the government has to make if they run out of money is to pay the bondholders, the general obligation bondholders. And that allowed Puerto Rico to get a lot of great loans to develop its economy. But now when you don't have any cash, that's obviously a problem. So there was a massive default. And Congress decided to approve this control board. So the pretext was, let's allow it to restructure. And that's why you have people like Lin-Manuel Miranda, several celebrities and others pleading for Congress to help. The problem is that when Washington says that it helps, sometimes it's actually making matters worse. This financial control board, which cannot stress enough how undemocratic it is. They have immunity. They can receive gifts and bequeaths. And yes, they can restructure the debt, but only after 5 of its 7 members decide to do so. And 4 of the members are Republicans and 3 are Democrats. So you have a mini microcosm of the gridlock in Washington and this financial control board in Puerto Rico. And they can basically override any regulation or any law that the elected officials of Puerto Rico and their legislature approve. And didn't have any economic incentives. It didn't get rid of the Jones Act. It didn't provide any new incentives or any powers for Puerto Rico to develop its economy. So what you'll have is a majority conservative financial control board that will impose more austerity on Puerto Rico without any room for financial growth. If there's no growth, there's no way Puerto Rico will pay back its debt. The pension system is broke. The healthcare system next year will run out of the increase under the Affordable Care Act. So you'll have hundreds of thousands of people without health insurance, and the government doesn't have the money to step in and supplement those funds. So that humanitarian crisis that was exaggerated and used to get this bill done will actually ensue if this control board isn't kept in check. And so I know that I have to wrap up soon, but my wish would be for listeners and viewers to realize that their elected officials here in the United States are causing irreparable harm to the Puerto Rican people. It's not the first time, but this time it can be a real challenge. More than 600,000 Puerto Ricans have left to go to the states where they can receive, equal treatment under healthcare and other programs. So my message is, if the U.S. doesn't solve this in Puerto Rico, it'll have to solve it here. In Florida, in Texas, North Carolina, and other states where Puerto Ricans are moving in droves. And this is a crisis for American citizens, and some help was warranted, but this was not the prescription.
Great. And apologies to everyone if you heard an echo. It turns out it was my microphone, so I'm muting myself, and I'll unmute I'll keep doing that. So apologies if you were hearing anything. So now we'll hear from Dr. Gisela Negromi Velasquez. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, we can't hear you, Doctor.
Okay. I appreciate all the information our guests provided, but I want to talk, I think it's clear now why we got to PROMESA, right? The huge debt, enormous debt, is actually out of proportion how much we owe and the amount that was really taken in a loan. So it's really out of proportion. But then we get to this PROMESA bill. It was approved on June the 30th, so it was a very recent bill that it was not even intended to be translated into Spanish. I really want to call attention to that. It was a bill that it was going to impact millions of Puerto Ricans and people who only speak Spanish. And then you have a bill that is going to apply to everybody, but there's no even an order or an intention to translate it. Language is very important, because we create reality with the words that we use, right? So they translated themselves as a junta de supervisión. So supervision is not the same as control, right? Therefore, the translation of the junta that was created to control Puerto Rico is being used as a safety net by the dominant culture to ease the public opinion and to avoid the colonial context that obviously emerges from the PROMESA Act. As previously mentioned, it really sends a message of redemption and salvation to the people being oppressed by the imposition of PROMESA. So having that clear, I want to say that with the implementation of PROMESA, it actually frees the demands of or lawsuits against the government until February 2017. The Junta de Control Fiscal will be able to control the decisions taken in Puerto Rico and to administer the finance of the state government. They have not even mentioned the word audit because they do not come to identify what does not have to be paid. They come to guarantee that the debt is paid regardless of its legality. The implementation of PROMIS implies submitting reports to the committee, La Junta de Control Fiscal, according to the request. The administration of the Governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla will have to present weekly reports of the cash flow of the government, the income and payments that enter to the arcs of the government, and will have to provide monthly bank statements of all the accounts, bills, detail the payments, and report if some payment has been done to what they call the national debt. I want to call the attention to the first meeting of the Junta because it takes as a practical effect the unilateral amendment of the Constitution of Puerto Rico. Having that first meeting, it was actually an amendment to our Constitution. Why? Because the official beginning of the Junta, what we have seen is how a group of North Americans have taken, for all the practical effects, the control of the central government, agencies, and public corporations. This action really amends the Constitution because it functions those are functions that typically correspond to the government of Puerto Rico. I want to go now and talk about the implications of PROMESA. So to talk about the implications, I want to mention that social work cannot be neutral. So the College of Social Workers in Puerto Rico made a public statement about our complete rejection of the Junta de Control Fiscal, because La Junta is not here to fix the economy or to develop an alternate economic model for Puerto Rico. They're not here to guarantee the provision of basic social services or to improve our life conditions. La Junta is committed with the bonistas, or the bondholder, and they're here to cut funds, to use those funds to pay the debt, again, regardless of the legality of the debt. Those costs are going to have a direct impact, in the provision of basic social services. Many public and private non-for-profit programs will lose and are already losing funding to provide services as usual. The third sector, which is the non-for-profit program, they're hurting already. They cannot pay their staff. Therefore, staff retention is a real problem. People cannot work if they are not getting paid, right? The Junta is the only one that can decide if Puerto Rico can go on bankruptcy or if we can restructure our own debt. They decide how to go about business. So we could say that the government of Puerto Rico and our people, we come for nothing. We can make suggestions, but the Junta decides. So the governor even has voice but no vote. So I have some words about the impact. I don't know if I have time.
You have 1 more minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. With PROMESA, people are already losing their jobs. We're facing the possible dismissal of thousands of workers or a reduction on the work hours. We're facing the privatization of the educational system and social services, the privatization of people's heritage, our better lands, the social distance between the rich and the poor is worsening. Social inequality is increasing. People are losing their homes. Families on the street are growing while services are decreasing. The elderly population is feeling the direct impact of PROMESA with cut on health and social services already in place. This is a growing population in Puerto Rico, the elderly, which implies the need for social support services that are already lacking and might even disappear in the near future, all in the hands of La Junta. So with PROMESA, it really becomes easier for our young people to continue living the country, because for this group, your age is sufficient to be kept under a new form of slavery and dependence. The long-term effects of the establishment of the Junta will not solve the problems of the country, since this group of people of the American government comes to represent the interests of the bondholders. Social workers were worried about the cuts in social services programs because at-risk population groups such as children, adolescents, young people, the elderly, among others, will suffer the direct impact of the lack of services to offer security and protection. We're worried because for programs directed to working with excluded populations, and we're worried about the University of Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Ani?
I just want to say that it's great that all the speakers have gone even deeper into the history of Puerto Rico. I think that's very important, especially for young people to learn more about the history. And often my experience is that when we do the conversation surrounding the relations between Puerto Rico and the United States, they're absent. And when they are present, it is from like one perspective and doesn't really include the entire truth. So I want to thank the speakers for that. So speaking of PROMESA, for the viewers who don't know exactly what it is, I'm going to clarify that. So it's the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, known as PROMESA, which would implement a federal fiscal oversight board to handle the fiscal situation and the $70 billion debt. Personally, when I was thinking about PROMESA, I was like, let's ask ourselves, how did this economic crisis even come to be, which the speakers touched on. So it'll be a little bit repetitive, but And to answer that question it's the colonial policies and historically and still today that play a big role in where we are at today in Puerto Rico. And for the past 100 plus years, the United States has responsibility or shared responsibility for the current economic crisis, yet they don't take any responsibility for what's currently happening in the destruction of the island standard of living and the destruction of the political autonomy and the natural resources in Puerto Rico. And I want to speak on when I first heard about PROMESA. It was actually a news article that I was reading, and in the news article it spoke about how Puerto Ricans both here in the mainland and on the island both are joining together and protesting against the Oversight Board and against PROMESA for several reasons. Some see this PROMESA Law as another exercise of colonial ruling, and it's seen as a band-aid, like not really addressing the root causes of what's going on, and it's been talked about almost like a distraction of the root causes. And when I speak of those causes, I'm talking about colonialism and the ongoing exploitation and the ongoing oppression of the Puerto Rican people. And the problem with the Oversight Board is that it was composed of 7 members that wasn't elected democratically by the Puerto Rican people, and that's a problem, and people see that that's a problem. And I think that we should question, so who are these people? Who are they? What are their interests or conflict of interests? What are their intentions? Because we need to question: is this law going to benefit the people of Puerto Rico? Is it going to benefit the economic development of Puerto Rico, or is it going to benefit the creditors? And those are important questions we should consider moving forward. And thank you.